I'm Charles Dunaway with WRFI Radio News. With me is Pete Navratil. Pete is a clinical social worker specializing in domestic violence who currently works with Resolve of Greater Rochester, an organization dedicated to intervening and preventing domestic and sexual violence, and is the founder of Stand Up Guys. Welcome, Pete.
Well, thank you.
First of all, could you tell us a little bit about Stand Up Guys, what it does, why you started it?
Yeah, Stand Up Guys, we've been around since 2004. This is actually our 10-year anniversary. And the backdrop for Stand Up Guys really came out of the work that my colleague and I, Jack Brennick, and I were doing in regards to offender accountability or batter intervention. Both of us, Jack a little longer than myself, we've been working in the domain of working with men who were mandated into a 26-week batter intervention program and really forced by their mandate to have to unpack issues related to power and control and use of aggression and tactics that men would use to be in control of their female intimate partners. That's pretty much where we were working. And the concept of stand-up guys was that we were having these conversations with men, some of the men in the program really getting some light bulbs turned on in terms of thinking about their own behavior and thinking about their choices and thinking about how they could do things differently. And that gave rise to the idea that we should really be engaging more well-intended men in the same types of conversations. And then the idea of prevention, kind of this idea of how do you stop something from happening before it happens. And so the idea of stand-up guys was about how do we engage well-intended men and how do we engage men in general in a dialogue about men's violence against women. Both from an awareness perspective, from a bystander perspective, and how do we prevent these types of tragedies from occurring in the first place. And right. So that's what we've been doing for the last 10 years.
Are there factors in a person's background that seem to make it more likely that they will become violent with an intimate partner?
Yeah, it's always a great question. You know, I think that there are some things that we can look at that might be some precursors on an individual or from offender to offender, different individual characteristics. And the way we can look at that is there may be a strong correlation around how a young guy was treated in his own early childhood, mm-hmm. and perhaps what he even witnessed or saw within his own family. If he grew up in a family where he observed violence being used as a way to resolve conflict, which is typically what we see, if he sees that on an individual basis or within the context of his own family, that puts him at a much higher risk to engage in those types of behaviors. And then we kind of draw it back even a lens further, which is some of what we try to do with stand-up guys is we also have to recognize that men live in a world that is filled with examples of how we use aggression to resolve conflict, whether that be through video games or even in sporting events. We tend to look at aggressive behavior as part of the male experience. And so it's not a hard leap to see how someone who may have grown up observing that and then having that be reinforced by what we see, for example, in hockey games, or what happens on NFL Sunday, where we are drawn to watching men be very physical with each other, and in a controlled, aggressive kind of way, we look at that as a form of entertainment. Or some of the more extreme sporting events where we literally lock men into cages and they go at it. And so the idea of thinking about how does that translate into an interpersonal relationship where a conflict arises and a situation gets to the point where particularly a guy may feel out of control in relation to the situation, or they have very strong emotions. And this idea of using aggression to resolve conflict or even to express negative emotion. We have a tolerance level for that. And so, in this particular case, as I was reading about what happened to Shannon Jones, it just, it struck me that, this is a man who obviously was reacting to a conflict and actually, and honestly reacted to it in a very violent way. And so seeing those things as being interconnected, they may be some things that happened within the perpetrator here, but also it's kind of this backdrop of this other dynamic that happens to men that make these things possible to happen. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of the examination of that, of both the bigger context and the individual dynamics.
You mentioned talking about working with people who are, shall we say, potential perpetrators who actually have not committed an act and gone into the criminal justice system. What are some signs that people in an intimate relationship should consider as warning signs that might signal that one of the parties might become violent with the other?
It's really just looking at these dynamics of what I would call power and control tactics, and what are some of the things, controlling behaviors that might include what the other person is wearing, how much time the other person can spend with friends. Are there controlling behaviors around how money is spent? And then is there sometimes a sense of jealousy or entitlement, where one partner might feel that the other person should be giving them what they want or they need. Mm-hmm. And so those dynamics, that feeling of being controlled or being examined in a kind of an unfair way, or being kept from doing the things that someone would want to do, if those dynamics are present in the relationship, and also I think extreme expressions of rage, if small incidences resolve in loud verbal expressions of aggression, where it's not always physical violence, but sometimes it's extreme yelling, mm-hmm. And maybe even threats, or destruction of property. And those are all kinds of tactics that a potential abuser might demonstrate.
So when you work with men who are potential abusers, what kind of treatment do you use? What kind of methods do you employ to try to move them away from that? And does it need to involve the intimate partner as well?
Well, I think what we try to do is, what our strategy is really, we work more with bystanders than we do with, say, potential. It's hard to demonstrate, it's hard to identify who might be a potential perpetrator. And usually those are identified by victims. Mm-hmm. It's kind of this strange dynamic where, perpetrators come out because they've acted in a way that they've made someone feel afraid. And until that happens, it's really hard to say who's a perpetrator, who's not, which is an unfortunate, I think, side effect. Sometimes we tend to treat all men as if all men are potential perpetrators, mm-hmm. which is a real problem, because if we do that, then a lot of us well-intentioned guys get a little offended because it's not something we would do.
Right.
So it's really hard to distinguish who's a potential and who's not. Mm-hmm. But I think what we try to do from a bystander perspective and from a general education perspective, I talk a lot about character matters, and we talk a lot about managing what I call destructive or negative emotions, which is, I think, related to things like resiliency. So what happens when we get into a situation where we're feeling really stressed out and things aren't going our way? What choices do we have? And do we have nonviolent choices? And it really becomes a matter of how we manage stress and how we manage our emotions, and recognizing that our behavior there's always a choice connected to whatever behavior we pick. So we look at this scenario that happened, to Shannon, is that the perpetrator here is as emotionally difficult as whatever it was that he was feeling at that moment. I think the article that I read said something like he snapped. this idea of snapping is really an interesting concept. It's really about recognizing how I might be feeling in the moment and stopping, taking a breath, and thinking about what choices I have. Even if I feel like I really want to do something harmful to someone, there's still space in there for me to think about it before I act. And so that's kind of that idea of teaching all people how to manage emotions, and especially the negative emotions, jealousy, rage, anger, those emotions that sometimes can really get us into bad places. And how do we manage those effectively? I don't view anger management necessarily as the answer, but dealing with negative emotions and finding where there are particularly counselors is another challenge for men, but making it okay for men, if they're really struggling with their feelings, to be able to go to some resource and ask for help.
I thank you very much for your insight on this. I've been speaking with Pete Navratil. He is a clinical social worker and the founder of Stand Up Guys in Rochester. This is Charles Dunaway, WRFI Radio News.